Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode number 83. I'm your host, Joe Hannan, Joe from Jersey, in autumnal New Jersey. Seasons are definitely starting to shift. There's something about this weird in-between weather where we're flirting with fall, but not quite in fall, that makes me really nostalgic. And I say nostalgic, I don't even know if that's the appropriate word, but it brings me back to my undergraduate days. There's something about this weather that conjures like this deep longing and like latent pain that's inside of me, which is kind of ironic because autumn is my favorite season. But yeah, there's just this angstiness that bubbles to the surface from being a highly emo teenager and young adult at that time. It makes me want to just put on Deja Entendu on repeat and drive around with my windows down. I might do that later. But I felt it in a big way last night. There was a newer student who came to school. I hadn't met them before. And they were a College of New Jersey student. And it was interesting for me. I don't know what year they were in. It could be a freshman, senior, whatever. But it was interesting for me to kind of put myself back in that time and to think about, well, like how might things have been different had I found jiu-jitsu at that time in my life instead of when I did? Maybe it would have been a totally different outcome. But I was certainly more of an emotionally raw nerve at the time. And I was rolling with this person, and I got the sense that they were sort of experiencing some of that undergraduate emotional rawness, and we're coping with it either consciously or unconsciously through the art. But yeah, there's something about the changing weather that always just brings me back there. It also just puts me in generally like a more reflective state. And I've had good reason to be a bit more reflective lately because I'm dealing with two injuries. One is the ankle injury that cropped up the night before I left for World Master. And the second is I had this strange thing happen with my back. So I wanted to take the opportunity today to talk a bit about injury in general and how my relationship to injury has changed over the years, especially now that I'm a black belt, especially now that I'm out of my competition season. So the ankle, as I had mentioned, was sort of a freak thing that happened the night before I left for Worlds, where I was training with somebody I probably shouldn't have been training with, and they did something unexpected, and they ended up injuring my ankle, kind of rolling on top of it. And part of the reason why that happened, why I allowed that to happen, was I was running the class, and it was a competition prep class. So I was sort of more focused on delivering a quality training experience for everyone else in the room and less so for myself. Had that momentary lapse of attention and judgment, and I kind of paid for it. Then the second injury was this issue with my back, which was a weird one. I had been training pretty hard at a Sunday open mat. Tends to be where I have some of my hardest training. No-gi open mat. Tends to attract a lot of upper belts, a lot of people about my size, and it's a scrap every week, and I love it. I've always loved it for that. I attribute my growth in the sport largely to the things I discovered the hard way at that open mat. So ordinarily, I would do a proper cool down after an intense training session like that, with emphasis on stretching out the lumbopelvic hip complex, basically the things that get tight from playing a lot of guard. And I've been playing an excessive amount of guard lately because I have this ankle injury and I don't feel confident on my feet, and I don't want to make it worse. So normally I would put in a lot of time working. I say a lot of that's a lot of time, 10 to 15 minutes after open mat, I would put into just static stretching and restoring all that musculature to its proper resting length. Because, when you're playing a lot of guard, we tend to be in more of a kyphotic posture. So hunched back with our knees drawn to our chest too. So that if you have tight hip flexors, tight psoas, it's going to not feel great. It's also going to overextend your lower back. So you need to take some time to kind of sort all that out, especially as you get older. I didn't have the time to do that on this Sunday open mat because we were having a staff meeting. So instead of stretching, I sat on a couch for an hour and a half, then got in my car, then went home and did a strength workout that involves Zercher squats. And for those of you guys who don't know, Zercher squat is different from a conventional squat because the barbell rests across the crook of your elbows, and you kind of hold your hands up by your chest to support the weight of the barbell. So the reason I'm doing that as opposed to a conventional back squat right now is because of the ankle. The Zercher squat sort of forces you to load and drive more through your heel bones and less through your toes. So if you have an ankle injury, it's a good coping mechanism. The problem is that it is going to engage your QL, your quadratus lumborum, which is this muscle group that I believe connects your last rib to the crest of your hip bone. So that's going to get engaged because you have this weight that's pulling you forward. You're going to need the QL to kind of stabilize the load. So my QL was already pissed from being overextended, from playing all that guard, and then from sitting on that couch. And just midway through the workout, I was like, oh God, I'm going to pay for this. Finished the workout. A little bit later, I got on the mower, and I had Cormac with me because he likes to mow the grass with me. And just every little bump in the road, my QL was spasming, essentially, trying to stabilize the body. So I really knew I had overdone it. And I've had this happen to me before where I've overworked the QL, and it was so bad once that I spent like a good 6 to 8 hours on my living room floor where I couldn't get up. And my good buddy Dan, the chiropractor who came with me to Vegas, was actually able to kind of talk me through some things on the phone to get me up and on my feet again. So it wasn't as bad as that, but I knew that if I didn't listen to what the injury was telling me, it was going to be this long-term debilitating thing. So that's where we get into this distinction between hurt versus injured, which I've talked about before on this podcast, but I'll recapitulate it for those of you who haven't heard it before. Hurt, to me, being hurt is an inevitability in jiu-jitsu. Like, I trained pretty hard last night during the open mat portion of class. I trained very hard on Sunday at our open mat, and there are all sorts of things on my body that hurt, from bruising or swelling or maybe overextending something a little bit. That compounded with general muscle soreness. I think I did Romanian deadlifts last Thursday, and as of yesterday, I was still feeling sore. I was still feeling some hurt from that. So when you get accustomed to training jiu-jitsu, you begin to be able to differentiate between like, what is this normal baseline of hurt and what is injured. And to me, injured is something that transcends that baseline. It's something that requires intervention, which is something that many grapplers, especially men, struggle with. I don't understand the male reluctance to go to a doctor, go to a chiropractor, go to a physical therapist, whatever you got to do to prevent something from spiraling out of control. But men really seem to struggle with that. But yeah, injury requires intervention, or you're going to deal with some lasting consequences. There's a compounding effect to being hurt too. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm working with this brilliant nutritionist right now who I'll talk a little bit about later in the podcast. There's a compounding effect to being hurt. There's certainly a compounding effect to being injured, but the real training and the real recovery, the real growth, and I think this is both from a strength and conditioning standpoint, the real recovery, training happens on the mat, but the real recovery and the real growth from a strength and conditioning component and for the jiu-jitsu component happens in the time during which we recover. For example, if we're trying to learn new technique or develop new skills on the mat, a lot of that burning in of the learning is going to happen when we're sleeping. From a lifting standpoint, strength and conditioning standpoint, we are always kind of behind. We're recovering from the stimulus that may have happened a week ago. So it's essential that in order for that to get that adaptation to happen, we need to be eating well, we need to be resting well. But eating well and resting well tend to get short shrift as opposed to doing more. We're very output driven. But we need to be input driven too in order to achieve that balance and to achieve that time for recovery. So injury happens when sort of the balance goes in the wrong direction. And this injury, the back particularly, because you can train around sprained ankles, it forced me to take some time away from the mats. And I know that there are a bunch of people out there potentially listening to this podcast who are in a similar position where they have been forced to take time away from the mats against their will. some cases with some pretty serious injuries. By comparison, mine's pretty mild. But I wanted to talk a bit about this to kind of normalize the feelings that arise during these times of injury. And the first is that there's this extreme difficulty for the adapted, committed grappler because they have become this thing that we call a jiu-jitsu grappler. It has become a portion of their identity. It's the language and the framework that they use to relate to the world. And then all of a sudden that's gone. That's taken away from them. And there's this question that comes up of like, okay, who am I without this thing? And who am I going to be in X number of weeks or months by the time I get back to this thing? Will it welcome me back? You know, it's almost like this fear of like going on an extreme long distance relationship. Like you're leaving your love on the East Coast to go to the West Coast for 6 months, and you don't know what's going to happen in that intervening 6 months. But I'm here to tell you, like, it's going to be there for you. It will be there for you when you come back. It might not be the same. You might need to come up to speed again, but you'll be surprised at how quickly you do come back. So this is going through my brain, having repeated this cycle now several times as a grappler. I've been injured. I've had serious injuries. I had an MCL injury. We also took a pretty extended period of time away from the mats when my son was born. And I'm not saying that those emotions don't arise. They're quite real. That fear and that sense of who am I without this thing are real, and they don't go away. But some perspective and some experience passes, and you get more skilled at dealing with them. So that's what I'm telling you. If you're listening to this right now and you're feeling the shock of loss, it's a momentary shock. It passes. And then the other thing I was thinking about as I was going through this back injury thing was I was sitting with this inertia from the major training push I had been engaged in since like April. I was in competition mode from April essentially through September, or until September. And that there's a lot of inertial carryover that came from that training stretch. And some of this ties into identity too. Who am I if I am not pushing myself to that extent? Am I the same person? Am I showing up in a way I should for the students and the other instructors in the school as an owner of the school if I'm not pushing myself to that extent? And then finally, the other train of thought that's running through my brain as I'm processing this injury and any other injury I've ever had is this addiction. Jiu-Jitsu is an addiction, for me at least. It's a coping mechanism. One of the frameworks I really like from a coaching perspective is motivational interviewing. And sort of the core tenet of motivational interviewing is this idea of resolving ambivalence. And what do I mean by that? Like, we can use a really sort of low-level example here. Let's take an example of cigarette smoking, nicotine addiction. I was a smoker through college, and to me, I knew that this was not something that was good for my health, but I did it anyway. There was some ambivalence there, right? I know this is bad for me, but I'm choosing to do it. Why did I choose to do it? Well, because nicotine solved a problem for me. It made me feel better. It calmed my anxiety. It helped me focus. It helped me settle myself. And frankly, like, it helped me meet people. It was sort of like a social gateway. I'll never forget, I had this history of the Vikings class. I want to say it was on like Thursday nights. And it was a 3.5-hour lecture. And there was always a break in the middle of it. And I was kind of like a lonely freshman or sophomore. And, I was smoking, and I would go out, and it would always be this cadre of interesting characters smoking outside the lecture hall during that break. And I got to know some people and made some friends that otherwise I wouldn't have. And the professor smoked too. So that was kind of like a little this inner circle that I made myself a part of by sort of engaging in this destructive habit. But smoking was serving a very critical function for me. So I had to make a decision. I had to search within myself. And a coach skilled at motivational interviewing would help me explore that ambivalence and help me kind of find my own reasons for wanting to change my behavior, right? So if I look at jiu-jitsu is a coping mechanism for me, much in the same way that cigarette smoking was. It's a way for me to process turbulent energy by using my body. And that's a net positive thing in some ways, but it's also a net negative in this situation where I'm pushing myself to the point of injury and beyond injury. I'm not doing what's right for my body. I'm not advocating for my cells, as the nutritionist I'm about to talk to later in this podcast would say. So I'm sort of coaching myself at the same time I'm dealing with this identity shock, this emotional and physical inertia of the intense training camp. I'm also kind of coaching myself through the nature of this addiction while I'm hurt. So there's a lot of shit going on here, folks. And I say this to encourage you not to just look within yourselves when you're hurt and see what's going on, but also to say that whatever you're seeing, whatever you're feeling, it's normal. You know, I've been there. We've all been there if we've been injured. And let's face it, most of us who have been in the game long enough have dealt with some injuries. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this idea that I just mentioned of advocating for ourselves, working with this brilliant nutrition, advocating for ourselves, working with this brilliant nutritionist right now, Dr. Clyde Wilson. And he's kind of overhauled not necessarily what I eat, but when I eat it. We're trying to improve certain biomarkers that shouldn't be the way they are on my metabolic panel. But my hypothesis and his is that, for example, let's say my A1C is a little bit elevated, my LDL is a little bit elevated. I recently had to go on antihypertensive medications. Why is this happening? You know, like for somebody who looks as fit as I am, seeing these numbers on a metabolic panel are kind of surprising. Well, why is this happening? It's happening because I'm not doing what's right for my cells. I'm engaging in this very intense, long, destructive training pattern because of this addiction in some ways. And while it might have superficial beneficial results, on a cellular level, my body is breaking down. And some of this is just a natural product of aging. I can't handle the same volume I used to do. And some of this is not a product of aging. It's just a product of bad decision making as a result of this psychological compulsion that I'm describing to you that has contributed to this injured state. So advocating for my cells in this case, I liken it to advocating for my son. You know, I'm doing this thing, this behavior that is prematurely aging my biology, according to Dr. Wilson, Dr. Clyde. For example, if my son were doing the same thing to himself, if he were pushing himself to this degree where his body was breaking down, would I be driving him forward? Would I be like spurring him on to do more of it? Absolutely not. So in this injured state, I'm trying to be more of that parent advocate for myself, taking a step out of the emotional inertia, taking a step out of that addictive mindset of being addicted to jiu-jitsu and saying to myself, if this were my son, this is what I would advise him to do, treating myself just the same. So this injury has given birth to this new way of looking at things in terms of structuring my training and structuring my intentions and incorporating this seasonality dimension to my training cycle, which we talked about on a previous episode. All of these things are filing into one another and converging in a way that I find really fucking beautiful. Now, the real challenge here is to see, can I continue to grow as a grappler while being more mindful of these dynamics? But at any rate, I would encourage any of you who are sitting here right now listening to this podcast, coping with an injury, or really any of you in general, because we do a combat sport. We're not playing badminton here. Most of us are going to get hurt at some point. You have to ask yourself these questions. Can I be kinder to myself in the face of this injury? Can I give myself what I need? And can I do it without the inner criticism or the judgment? Just the same way I would if it were my son who were hurt. And, you know, I'll say this last thought before I go here on what may be a shorter podcast. Every time I've been hurt, to date, my worst injury was tearing my MCL. And I remember the day clearly. It was this hazy kind of day like today where I just hadn't slept well the night before. And I was tired and I was beat up. And I just had a bad feeling something was going to happen on the mat to me that night. But I overrode it and I ignored it because I was afraid of missing out, I suppose. I was afraid of missing the opportunity to move myself closer to my goals. And I went anyway, and I was training with this day one student who was bigger than me and kind of spastic. And I had him in mount, and he did something no one's ever done before, which was he kind of rolled belly down in mount, but he kind of rolled out to the side and rolled over my heel bone, tearing my MCL. It sounded like somebody ripped a piece of paper. And I felt like I was just going to pass out because I knew whatever had just happened was horrible. And I also was thinking to myself, what a fool you were, because you knew that something was going to happen tonight and you went anyway. And the same thing happened the night I hurt my ankle getting ready for Worlds. Like, I knew, I had this premonition that something was going to happen. And I really do believe this is nothing mystical. This is my body, my cells, my physiology saying to me, you're overreaching. We have carried this as far as we can go, brain. So if you don't listen to us, something is going to happen. Something did happen on both of those occasions. So today I'm feeling that premonition. My ankle hurts from training the past 2 nights. My back feels sore, but not injured. And you know what? I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to rest. I'm going to give myself what I need. I'm going to advocate for my cells the way I would advocate for my son. So that's all I've got for you this week, folks. We've got some interesting guests coming up in the coming weeks in October. I just want to leave you with a reminder that the PBJJ Book Club kicks off this Sunday, September 29th at 7:30 p.m. at the school. You also have the potential, I'm opening this to students of the school and also to listeners of this podcast. You have the potential to attend in person if you're in New Jersey, or there will also be a Zoom link where you can jump in and discuss with us. First book is going to be the namesake of this podcast, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. If you've never read Meditations, I strongly suggest that you do. It's a participation requirement for this book club. But beyond that, it's one of the most edifying reads you'll ever encounter. And you can find it free all over the internet, so no need to spend money on it if you don't want to. Also, we have these wonderful things in our communities called public libraries where you can get just about any source of media for free. Modern miracle, the library system. I try to support my local library as much as I can. But yeah, would love to see you, talk to you, and hear your ideas about meditations. This is something that I'm going to be doing on a monthly basis at the school, and it's open to listeners of this podcast. Also, stay tuned for some merchandise. We've got 2 shirt designs that are going to be dropping next month. And stay tuned for other developments, other fascinating guests, other introspective nightmares brought to you by BJJ Meditations. Thank you very much for listening, folks, and we will talk next week.